Hello. As this week, now we're moving through the July days, the 15th Sunday of the ordinary time or regular time. The readings, the first reading comes from the prophet Amos, chapter 7, verses 12 through 15. The second reading begins a couple of sections that we will be listening to over the next couple of weeks from the letter attributed to Paul to the Ephesians, and it will be the opening chapter 1, verses 3 through 14. And the gospel is from Mark chapter 6, picks up where we left off last week at verse 7 and goes to verse 13. I'd like to begin this time by going to the first reading, which is from the writing of the prophet Amos. Now, in the tradition of writing prophets, and there are two traditions in the Bible, the books attributed to prophets we would call writing prophets. There are other prophets, such as Elijah and Elisha, who do not write anything, but we get a lot of action. Amos is generally recognized as the first of the writing prophets. And in the section that we here are given this week, does not begin where you might expect in chapter 1, but begins in chapter 7, in which the author, that is Amos, explains a little bit his mission and why he is there. Now, you remember what had happened, a little bit of biblical history here, that when the great King Solomon had died around the year 950, before the common time, an argument had broken up over who should be the king, and should it be a successor of David, like Solomon was, or should it be the right man who would most appropriately be able to lead the people? The result of that controversy was the division of the Holy Land into two kingdoms, known as the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom, known as the kingdom of Judea. When you took the famous 12 tribes or 12 sons of Jacob and divided them, 10 of the tribes belonged to the northern kingdom, and one, that is, belonged to the southern kingdom, that would be Judea, or the tribe of Judah. Now, all of that is kind of background. There continued to be an ongoing struggle between the North and the South, and much of the history, however, of this section of the Bible was written by the Southerners, the Judeans, so as you might guess, their viewpoint about what went on in the North often was colored as less than perfect, whereas in the South, which also found the city of Jerusalem to be located, was more correct, or the only correct one at times. Now, what had happened is that the king at that time, Jeroboam II, ruled from the year 783 to the year 743 before the common time. There was a weakness on the part of the leadership in a certain way, and Amos comes on the scene around the year 750 and is warning the leadership, which was basically resting in priests and kings, that they weren't playing in the right game, that things were going to go wrong. And as we will hear, that little section that is offered for our consideration on Sunday deals with that very issue, because the warning was that there's a little upshot empire beginning, namely the Assyrians, who have their eye on the northern kingdom. And the problem was that both the northern and southern kingdom were very prosperous, see? And that's a concern. When things are going well, when the economy is good, then maybe the kind of watching what you're doing is not always as alert as it might be. And so there was a shrine set up at Bethel, which was an ancient shrine dating all the way back to the times of Jacob. Jacob had a vision there and had set up a shrine is a special place where God is remembered and where the community can gather to pray on certain occasions. And it was there at Bethel that Jacob had his famous dream of God visiting him, and even Jacob's name at that point had been changed to Israel. So now you see the connection. The northern kingdom called itself Israel, appropriately kind of tracing its history all the way back to that. Bethel was the last town of consequence in the northern kingdom for those who were on the road to Jerusalem. Jeroboam II, now not the third, but the second, had tried to set up a rival shrine to Zion. And that's where now we find Amos the prophet coming, where the priest, Amizad, tells Amos to go home. He says, "Why are you here?" Because Amos, by the way, if you read through the rest of Amos, and we will get little sections from the book of Amos throughout the Sunday cycles, can be sort of grumpy. He would not, I would say he wouldn't be exactly, smiling and happy with his words, often very, very challenging. But Amizah says to Amos, "Look, we don't need you up here from the south, up here in the north, to tell us what we should be doing and what we are doing that's not right." So apparently the priest sends to the king, says what Amos is doing, and asks him to make sure that Amos gets kind of the thumb to return home. It's at this point that Amos explains a little bit his background. He says, "Look, I never wanted this job. I was down there in the south taking care of the farm that I was on. I was a herdsman, I was a farmer. I was a raiser of sycamore trees." Now, please do not think of sycamore trees like we think of them here in this country. They probably would be best called a mulberry tree. And what's interesting about the mulberry tree is that at a certain point, as the fruit is growing, it needs to be bruised in order to grow more fully. Isn't that interesting? And that's what Amos says. I was good at that, and God called me to this task. I'm not the member of a prophet group, and at this point in Israel's history, there were men who kind of lived together, much I suppose like sometimes people in religious communities live together. Said, by profession, I'm not a prophet. So there were I suppose we could say professional prophets. It was their job to speak the word to the people, to speak in behalf of God. Amos says, that's not my connection. I am not a member of those. And so, in a way, I have no personal stake in prophecy. I do this because God has asked me to. Now, as we will note, if you notice, reading the prophet Amos, he has 4 visions, and all of them are kind of detrimental to Israel's future. Remember when I talk about Israel now, he's talking about the northern kingdom, okay? There will be, first vision, a swarm of locusts, and they will come and inflect and take over everything. As you know, locusts are kind of natural. But you might also know that one locust is not called a locust, but a grasshopper. So when you have a bunch of grasshoppers working together, they're called locusts. I think there's something of this going on even in our own Southwest these days. So there's an update from that point, from that experience. Anyway, he as a second vision, which interesting translation is there is a plumb line. Now, perhaps a better translation here is a wall of tin. And this means you're going to use weapons. And again, the prophet Amos says, not going to work. You shouldn't be doing these things. So we don't exactly know what the king's response was to the priest Amiazak when he asked that Amos be sent home. We do know that the priest seems to be acting on operating on royal orders, or was he telling Amos to go on his own initiative? There are a couple of assumptions that are working. A lot's going on just in this little scene, by the way, in which you have this clash between a priest and a prophet. And that kind of clash will often take place in the stories of the writing prophets. As I say, Amos is the first of the writing prophets. His mission is to the north and to the northern kingdom, but he is really a prophet who comes from Judea, who comes from the south. So Amos returns, and as you might guess, a few years later, the Assyrians overtake the northern kingdom and lead particularly its leaders into exile. So why is this given for our consideration today? Because this prophet is sent by God to announce his message to the people of the north. One who is sent. And that we will see is a connection now to the gospel. The gospel picks up, as I mentioned, the story of Jesus. You remember last week we saw how there had been a rejection of Jesus in his hometown. The next verse, right after that story, pictures Jesus as moving around the region with his disciples and teaching and healing. So that's the one, remember we said last time that you had 6a and 6b? Well, 6b is just that reference to Jesus being a teacher. Now, as verse 7 of chapter 6 continues, Jesus is pictured as now sending the disciples out on mission. Having been unsuccessful in his vision to his hometown, and having made a tour of the surrounding villages and teaching, he now is going to share his mission, the mission of proclaiming the kingdom, with the 12. And they will continue beyond the immediate disciples that were kind of hanging out with him. They are now going to go on mission. Now, once again, as always, one of the characteristics of the Markan tradition is, you remember, this use of the bookend style. Namely, you start a story, you finish a story, and you interject a story in between. So today, we get the start of the story, that Jesus will send the 12 out on mission. Later on, there's a story that goes in between now. Later on, they will return from their mission and give a report. And that, by the way, giving us a heads up, is the gospel for next week. So for this week, how does Jesus send them out? Well, as we read, he invites them to travel lightly. Now, there's a characteristic of this is that often there were what we would call itinerant or wandering philosophers, and they would bring their kind of paraphernalia with them, much like, I suppose, a backpack in which they carried the necessary foods and items that they would need to stay. Jesus here, in a tradition which was well known in Judaism, to travel lightly, of course, ultimately the reason for this is that the disciples would trust in God. So what were they to take? They were to take no food They were to take no traveling bag, and they were to take no money. Well, now you think about it, what does that mean? You're going to have to find some food where in places where you go. You're going to have to find lodging for the place where you are. And of course, you're not going to be able to pay them for anything that they give. This, of course, is the principle of hospitality, which we've spoken of many times in our talks here, which was a well-known virtue and value of the Mediterranean world of the first century. So that if strangers came to your door, you were certainly required by the rule of hospitality. It would probably be a capital rule, and to violate it would probably be, to use a traditional church word, a mortal sin, not to help that person. So once they stepped across the threshold of your house, you would be expected to give them something to eat. You would be expected to give them a bed for the night, and you were expected to do that as another fellow human being. So when Jesus tells his disciples to do that, nothing terribly original there, although, as I say, there were other traveling philosophers who did bring their own stuff with them and who did not require this kind of help. Now, what does he say that they can bring with them? Two things which are exclusively found in the Gospel of Mark, and when the Gospel writers Luke and Matthew pick up on this same story, they say that the disciples cannot take. So what are the two things that the disciples can take? Sandals and staff. They can wear sandals so they're not, and as we've mentioned before, walking barefoot on these roads could be kind of irritating to your feet, even no matter how tough they might get because you weren't wearing sandals. And a staff. Now, the staff, of course, traditionally is symbolic of power and authority. One remembers, of course, that the great one, Moses, had a staff, and at one point when he cast the staff down, it had turned into a snake. And so the staff was not simply something to help them walk, although certainly like a cane, I suppose we could say it did serve that. But it also, as I say, had the idea of a certain authority. And Aaron, the brother of Moses, also, you remember, had a staff. So as they make the journey, they are to, as best they can, bring the good news of the story to the place where they go. Now, they're also encouraged not to move around a lot, but to accept whatever hospitality they would receive in the place where they are. And if the message is received well, if people are willing to listen, then that's exactly what their mission in behalf. And notice what has happened here is that Jesus is sharing his power with the disciples. After all, Jesus had been given the power from God to be proclaimer of the kingdom. Now Jesus is sharing that power which is his with his disciples. If, however, they don't listen to you and they find it is difficulty to accept you, here's what you are to do. And this would be a traditional custom also. Shake the dust off your feet and move on. Now, why was that important? Even if you had sandals on, you might have some dust in your feet, okay? Because the dust or the dirt belong to the place. And so if they don't want anything to do with the message, leave it behind. Don't take it with you. Don't bear a grudge. Don't say, well, I didn't accept the message. Just move on. So there is a kind of wisdom here that Jesus is picturing his disciples to have. Now, also, as he will say, that they are given the power, along with proclaiming the message, they are given the power to drive out, to heal. the power to deal with sickness. Now, what exactly is at work here? And I thought maybe just a reminder that the people of Jesus' time had a strong belief in the existence of spirits. There were spirits who roamed in the world, and in fact, these spirits were ranked according to their power. And some who have studied this notice that there were really 5 ranks of power. The first one belonged to God, to our God. The second rank belonged to other gods, sons of gods, archangels. They had a share in this power. The third were the less powerful non-human persons. So they weren't humans, but they were non-human. Who would those be? Angels, spirits, and demons. So demons fell into the class of a spirit who had a certain power. Fourth level was that of humans, and the fifth level were creatures lower than humans. Now what Jesus does here with the disciples, very subtly, is raise his disciples from the fourth level there, stage, to the third, giving them the power to deal like angels, spirits, and demons could do, to deal with. And really, what was it that often the demonic was considered to be in control of? Sickness. And so therefore, the disciples, it's kind of an interesting little gesture that Jesus is making here of giving his disciples the ability to heal sickness. So all of that is part of the mission to which the disciples are now sent. Inspired by God, trusting as Jesus did in God's way, and carrying out the mission of spreading the news of God's kingdom. Now what follows immediately, and we will not be hearing this in the reading either this week or next, is what is the sandwich section. The sandwich section falls into 2 parts. It deals with John the Baptist. John the Baptist, you remember, had been a precursor of Jesus and had been arrested by Herod Antipas. Now Herod Antipas technically was called a king, but he really was Roman appointed. And therefore, because he was allied with Rome, was called a tetrarch. Now, the task of this Herod Antipas was one of 3 sons of Herod the Great, and his territory to rule, you remember, was the Galilee and the territory of Perea. He had been appointed to this task after the death of his father in 4 BCE, and it was his job to represent Roman rule and interest in his territory. So although he was a king, he really was kind of carrying out what it was that Rome wanted to be done. We know that Herod Antipas ruled in the Galilee until the year 39, at which point he was deposed and exiled by Gaius Caligula, who was the emperor at the time. Somewhere along the line, Herod marries Herodias, who became his wife, and who also, by the way, was the granddaughter of Herod the Great. Her brother, Agrippa I, was later the ruler of the Galilee between 41 and 44, and he was a friend of Gaius Caligula. Now, all of that background, you're saying, do we need to know that? Well, Herodias had been the wife of Philip, his brother, and although that is very strange to us, and we might certainly raise the moral issue of this, had been left Philip and married Herod. These things were not unknown, but when John the Baptist comes and tells Herod and Herodias that what they have done was not right, Herodias becomes quite angry. And she nurtures in her heart that she will get back at this prophet for what he is trying to do. So Herod, inspired perhaps by Herodias, arrests John and puts him in prison. Now, as the text will say, Herod he didn't know what to do with John. He had to listen to his wife, I suppose, but he kind of would listen to John the Baptist talk, and he kind of liked him. But one day, and this is the story now that is found next, Herod has a birthday party, and he invites all the important people of the place there, the upper crust, the power brokers. And as they are having this birthday party and, kind of enjoying themselves and perhaps having a few beers more than was good, or wines, whatever was the drink of choice, the daughter of Herodias, who is not named, comes in and does a dance. And apparently it inspires the eyes of the guys to kind of be smiling. And so moved is Herod that he says, and this, of course, there's an irony here, because it's something that Herod really couldn't do. But anyway, he says, because you're such a wonderful dance, I will give you whatever you want, even to half my kingdom. Now, you can imagine what that would be. Well, the girl goes to her mother, Herodias, and says, what should I ask for? And Herodias says, well, I would like the head of John the Baptist brought in on a platter. Now, I don't know how her daughter responded. Now, by the way, this dance of the young girl, the text is rather ambiguous about it. But movie people and later stories like to suggest that she gave a very suggestive dance, the kind of things that men kind of would like, and that's what motivated them and brought smiles and whatever else on men's eyes, assuming that only men were at this dinner, although there might have been wives of the invited guests, so we don't know. Or could it have been just a cute little child? She wasn't yet 12, and kind of said, like we like little kids who do these dances, isn't this cute? And so there is no real evidence that it was, as one might suggest, some kind of sexual display, but simply that it caused them all to kind of smile, blink their eyes, and hope that things would go well. By the way, she is not named, although later tradition calls her Salome. That's, again, because movies and theaters and plays have all liked this character and given her a whole reputation that, to his credit, Mark does not give. Anyway, the wish of the girl from her mother is carried out, and they bring in on a tray the head of John the Baptist to the girl. The girl gives it to her mother. Interestingly, it does not say that Herod saw the head of the Baptist. Now, what is this? By the way, this story is generally recognized as a premonition story, because if John the Baptist stood against authority, Jesus and his disciples might be a little cautious that if they stand against authority, something similar might happen to them. Anyway, this is the story now that takes place while the disciples are out there proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. By the way, beheading and crucifixion were two ways certainly that ended people's lives who dared to stand against authority. And so I suggest that in the death of the Baptist, who, by the way, we did not know as this story began, had died. It was Herod who had mentioned that he had executed the Baptist. Next week, we will find out what happens when the disciples return from their mission and how well the message of the Baptist is going to be part of their story. Thank you for being with us, and have a good week.